Atari Lynx. When Nintendo dropped the Game Boy in 1989, it changed everything. Suddenly, the idea of gaming on the go wasn't just a gimmick, it was the future. Atari saw the hype and immediately tried to one-up Nintendo with the Atari Lynx, a handheld that looked like it came straight out of science fiction. It had a backlit color LCD screen, something Nintendo's little gray brick didn't even dream of at that time. It could scale and rotate sprites, meaning 3D-like effects on a portable in the late 80s. Even cooler, the Lynx was ambidextrous. You could literally flip it around and play left-handed or right-handed with ease. On paper, it sounded like a Game Boy killer. But here's the problem. Atari copied Nintendo's formula without copying Nintendo's discipline. The Lynx was huge, expensive, and devoured 6 AA batteries in under 5 hours, while the Game Boy ran for nearly 15 on just 4 of them. And while Nintendo had Tetris and soon Pokemon to anchor the system, Atari couldn't secure that kind of killer app. The Lynx became the flashy gadget everyone wanted to try, but almost no one wanted to actually buy. Instead of dethroning the Game Boy, it became a warning shot, showing that raw power alone wasn't enough to topple Nintendo's dominance. Sega Game Gear. Just 1 year after the Game Boy stormed the market, Sega decided they weren't going to let Nintendo dominate handhelds without a fight. Enter the Game Gear. Launched in 1990 in Japan and 1991 worldwide, Sega's pitch was simple. Everything the Game Boy did, but in full color. Instead of a dull gray screen, the Game Gear gave players a bright, backlit display, essentially putting a portable Master System in your hands. To sweeten the deal, Sega bundled it with columns, their answer to Tetris, hoping lightning would strike twice. At first glance, it looked like Sega had cracked the code. Kids who saw Game Gear in ads couldn't believe a handheld could run Sonic the Hedgehog in full color, but reality set in fast. The Game Gear was bulky, required 6 AA batteries, and drained them in just 3 to 5 hours, compared to the Game Boy's legendary 15+. Developers also weren't lining up to make exclusives, so most of the library felt like watered-down Master System ports. And while Nintendo was quietly building a cultural empire with Tetris and later Pokemon, Sega's handheld never had that one defining, must-own game. In the end, the Game Gear looked better but lived shorter, another reminder that copying Nintendo's ideas wasn't the same as matching their execution. PlayStation DualShock. When Nintendo unveiled the N64 in 1996, it wasn't just about polygons, it was about how you controlled them. The 3-pronged controller introduced an analog stick and later the rumble pack, letting players actually feel the action in their hands. Sony, watching from across the aisle, knew they had to respond. The result came in 1997 with the DualShock controller for the PlayStation. At first glance, it looked like a slightly bulkier version of the original pad, but this was a direct play on Nintendo's innovations. Sony baked in not 1, but 2 analog sticks, allowing smoother 3D navigation, and added vibration motors without requiring an accessory. Here's the twist. While Nintendo pioneered the idea, Sony perfected it. The Rumble Pack was optional, bulky, and drained batteries. DualShock made Rumble a standard part of every controller, and the twin sticks quickly became essential for camera control in 3D games. Developers flocked to it, and soon it wasn't just a copy. It was the industry standard. By the time the PlayStation 2 arrived, the DualShock layout had become so iconic that nearly every controller since, across Xbox and even Nintendo itself, followed its blueprint. What started as a response turned into dominance. Bandai WonderSwan. In 1999, Bandai decided to take a shot at Nintendo's handheld throne with the WonderSwan. It had something no other rival could claim, the pedigree of Gunpei Yokoi, the legendary designer who created the Game Boy itself. After leaving Nintendo, Yokoi partnered with Bandai to craft a system that would outsmart, not outmuscle, Nintendo. The WonderSwan was sleek, cheap, and efficient. It ran for up to 40 hours on a single AA battery, a direct counter to power-hungry competitors like the Game Gear. Even more clever, its button layout allowed players to hold it horizontally or vertically, letting developers experiment with puzzle games and shooters in new ways. Bandai wasn't just copying Nintendo's formula of simplicity, they were doubling down on it. But the timing couldn't have been worse. Pokemon had completely taken over the Game Boy ecosystem, cementing Nintendo's dominance with an unstoppable cultural wave. By the time Bandai tried to fight back with the upgraded WonderSwan color, Nintendo dropped the Game Boy Advance, which instantly made Bandai's machine feel like yesterday's news. Despite some popular Japan-only titles like Final Fantasy ports, the WonderSwan never expanded beyond its home country. It remains a fascinating case, a handheld designed by the father of the Game Boy, undone by the very monster he helped create. If you've enjoyed the video so far, be sure to drop a like and subscribe down below for more. Geo Pocket Color. Also in 1999, SNK decided to jump into the handheld arena with the Geo Pocket Color, clearly chasing Nintendo's Game Boy Color audience. The design echoed Nintendo's cartridge-based simplicity, but SNK added their own arcade twist, a micro-switch thumbstick that felt almost like a tiny arcade joystick. For fighting games, it was a revelation. The library featured titles like King of Fighters R2 and the crossover of SNK vs Capcom, the match of the millennium, which felt like the handheld miracles compared to most competitors. The system was affordable, had strong battery life, and technically ticked all the right boxes. But once again, it didn't matter. Nintendo's Game Boy wasn't just a device, it was an ecosystem ruled by Pokemon. No matter how polished SNK's fighting games were, they couldn't compete with Pikachu's stranglehold on the market. And when SNK itself hit financial trouble in the early 2000s, support for the Pocket Color dried up almost overnight. The Neo Geo Pocket Color wasn't a bad copy, it was arguably one of the best designed handhelds to come out of that wave, but copying Nintendo meant fighting not just their hardware, but their cultural momentum, and that's where even the most clever ideas got buried. Nokia N-Gage. By 2003, Nintendo's Game Boy Advance was running the handheld market, and everyone wanted in. That's when Nokia, then the king of mobile phones, decided they could merge two worlds, gaming and cellular. The result was the N-Gage, a device shaped like a Game Boy Advance but with phone functions bolted on. It used cartridges, had a D-pad, and even supported multiplayer through Bluetooth, clearly modeled after Nintendo's formula, just mashed with a phone. The problem? It was a copy done wrong. To swap games, you literally had to remove the battery, an absurd design flaw for a portable console. Even making a phone call became a meme, with players holding the device sideways against their head in what became known as side-talking. It was supposed to be the Game Boy Advance killer, a device that played Tony Hawk's Pro Skater on the go and doubled as your everyday phone. In reality, it was clunky, overpriced, and had no killer exclusive. Nintendo had Pokemon, Advanced Wars, and Mario. Nokia had buggy ports of console games and a reputation for awkward design. The N-Gage didn't just fail, it became a punchline. Proof that copying Nintendo's handheld dominance wasn't as simple as adding a phone keypad. PlayStation Move. When Nintendo's Wii exploded in 2006, motion control suddenly became the hottest idea in gaming. Millions of families who had never touched a console were swinging Wii remotes like tennis rackets, and Sony wasn't about to let Nintendo own that market. 4 years later, in 2010, they unveiled the PlayStation Move, a pair of wand-like controllers topped with glowing orbs, tracked by the PlayStation Eye camera. It was Sony's direct attempt to mimic the Wii's magic, but with more precision and higher fidelity. On a technical level, the Move was impressive. The glowing ball allowed the camera to track depth, and pairing it with the PlayStation 3's power meant games could look far more advanced than anything on the Wii. Launch titles like Sports Champions were essentially Sony's answer to Wii Sports, and later, the Move would find new life as part of PlayStation VR, but as a Wii competitor, it never captured the same cultural wave. The Wii wasn't just about technology, it was lightning in a bottle, with timing, accessibility, and novelty all working in its favor. By the time Sony tried to copy it, the fad had already peaked. The PlayStation Move proved capable but forgettable, remembered more as a VR accessory than as Nintendo's true rival. Xbox 360 Kinect. By 2010, Nintendo's Wii had already proven that motion controls could move consoles by the tens of millions. Microsoft wanted in, but instead of copying the Wii remote, they tried to outdo it with no controller at all. The result was the Kinect, a camera system for the Xbox 360 that tracked your entire body using depth sensors and skeletal mapping. The pitch was futuristic. Wave your hands, kick your legs, and the game would follow your every move. At launch, it worked, at least as a spectacle. Kinect Sports and Dance Central became living room hits, and the device even broke a Guinness World Record as the fastest selling consumer electronics product ever. For a moment, it looked like Microsoft had leapfrogged Nintendo's motion control idea, but the cracks showed quickly. Kinect required a ton of space, its tracking was imprecise, and hardcore gamers found little reason to play without a controller. Unlike Nintendo, Microsoft never delivered a true killer app that defined the hardware. By the time the Xbox One launched with Kinect forced into every box, players had already moved on. The Kinect became a cautionary tale. You can copy Nintendo's trends, even scale them bigger, but if the magic isn't there, the hype fades just as fast. PlayStation Classic. In 2016 and 2017, Nintendo hit a nostalgic goldmine with the NES Classic and SNES Classic. Tiny plug-and-play consoles loaded with built-in games became impossible to find, sparking a collector frenzy. Sony saw the craze and wanted a piece of it, so in 2018, they launched the PlayStation Classic, a miniature version of the original PlayStation, bundled with 20 games and HDMI support. It was, without question, a direct copy of Nintendo's retro console formula, but while Nintendo's classics felt like love letters, the PlayStation Classic felt rushed. Fans immediately noticed glaring omissions. No Crash Bandicoot, no Gran Turismo, no Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. To make matters worse, many of the included titles weren't even the US versions. They were slower PAL editions that played poorly on modern TVs. The emulation itself was inconsistent, with frame drops and input lag that stripped away the nostalgia Sony was trying to sell. Instead of celebrating the PlayStation's legacy, the Classic highlighted how badly the company misunderstood it. Nintendo's minis became treasures. Sony's mini was clearance bin fodder within months. It's one of the clearest examples of copying Nintendo's formula without capturing the care and detail that made it work. Valve Steam Deck. When the Nintendo Switch launched in 2017, it completely rewrote what a console could be. A hybrid handheld that you could dock to the TV, it became an instant cultural icon. By 2022, Valve decided to follow that blueprint with the Steam Deck. At first glance, it looked like a Switch built for PC gamers, handheld form factor, dual analog sticks, triggers, a touchscreen, and even a dock for TV play. It was clearly inspired by Nintendo's design. But here's the twist. Valve didn't just copy the Switch, they expanded it. Instead of being locked to Nintendo's library, the Steam Deck opened the door to an entire Steam catalog, plus mods, emulators, and even Windows installs if you wanted. Suddenly, the Switch-like concept wasn't limited to Mario and Zelda, it was everything. The device wasn't perfect. It was big, heavy, and battery life could tank depending on the game, but it set off a new wave of handheld PC competitors, from the Asus ROG Ally to Lenovo's Legion Go. In the end, the Steam Deck proved that copying Nintendo isn't always a dead end. Sometimes, if you take their ideas and twist them into something broader, you don't just taste them, you create an entirely new lane. Thanks for watching.